Can we start? Hi, greetings everyone. This is Matthew Cherian welcoming you to this webinar by Dr. Stavros Nicolaou. It is on COVID lessons learned. Dr. Nicolaou has got deep experience in supply chain in the pharmaceutical industry. He is an executive in the pharmaceutical industry, and he was also the recipient of the IPS medal. So I'm going to turn this over to Mr. Nicolaou. You can go to the next slide.
Yeah, Matthew, good afternoon, good morning if you're in a different time zone to us. I see there are a couple of participants still joining, so I'm going to try and make some introductory remarks just to allow a few more colleagues to join, and then I'll go into the slides, and I acknowledge that some of the colleagues like Sumaya from Lebanon is sending greetings, and many other colleagues. So let me commence first of all by saying what a great pleasure it is for me to participate in this seminar workshop. I'm deeply indebted and very grateful to FIP, which is, of course, a wonderful organization for pharmacists. I happen to be a pharmacist like most of you on this call. And my presentation today, which is partly anchored in personal experience and partly anchored in what is required to achieve health security on the African continent in our lifetime. I'm acutely aware that I'll be speaking mainly about Africa, but the truth of the matter is that unless we achieve global health security, we will never achieve global peace and security. So Africa does have the most disproportionate disease burden of any continent in the world. It has the weakest of healthcare systems of any continent, and was also the continent during COVID and just about any pandemic we speak about that is the least capacitated and resourced. So I'll be speaking quite a bit about Africa as well. But again, just before I dive into my slides, let me say what a wonderful pleasure it is to be here and presenting to many pharmacists and colleagues from around the world. I also do this today because I feel that very often the role of the pharmacist is a rather understated one, and one of the professions that did most of the heavy lifting during COVID and had significant impact in turning the tide against the COVID pandemic were in fact pharmacists. So I'm going to give you a perspective today from an industrial pharmacist who was deeply seized and occupied with the pandemic in South Africa and more broadly the African continent. I'll give you a little history into that, and I'm going to turn the clock back to January 2020. So January 2020, I was on the beach because we have our summer vacation is over December and January in South Africa. And I was on the beach in early January and started getting a number of calls, including from our own ministry here in South Africa, saying, what do you think about what's going on with COVID? Of course, it was called something else in those days. I had calls from my colleagues in France, in Italy. These are Aspen colleagues. I work for Aspen. Aspen Pharmacare is Africa's largest pharmaceutical manufacturer. And I was getting all these calls saying we cannot supply sufficient general anesthetics and muscle blockers. And we don't know why there's this sudden surge demand and what is going on. And of course, as we all know, some of the hardest hit countries initially were in continental Europe. And we'll never forget the harrowing images of COVID patients dying in corridors and car parks because they couldn't find beds in Italian hospitals, particularly in northern Italy. And patients couldn't be ventilated. So why was this the surge in general anesthetics? And Aspen is a major supplier of general anesthetics around the world. It's because these patients needed to be ventilated. So that was an early signal, an early detection. The virus hadn't hit South Africa yet. Our first reported case of COVID was on the 6th of March, 2020, so some 2 months later. But what it did do is it gave us an early glimpse into what we might expect. And as I said, you had a call from our Minister of Health, the ministry in South Africa, and saying, well, what do you think? And are we going to be able to respond as a country? We better start preparing. And then around about the 14th of March of that year, our president of the Republic of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, who had just assumed chairmanship of the African Union. It's a rotating presidency, as it is with the European Union, for example. And it was probably fortuitously, I think, South Africa's turn to chair the African Union, and our president convened a meeting of business leaders. There were 12 business leaders, I remember, in the room. I was the only one from the healthcare sector. And the meeting was called to discuss how South Africa might respond to a looming economic crisis that might manifest pre, peri, and post-COVID. And I was in the room there were a number of cabinet ministers in the room, including the finance minister, the trade minister, etc. And I was joined by my business colleagues who were bankers, miners from the mining sector, from the services sector. And as I said, I was the only one from healthcare. And they all gave their inputs as to what needs to happen about managing the economy during the crisis and what we do to boost economic growth during what would be anticipated to be a difficult period. And I spoke last and I said, Mr. President, please discard everything my colleagues have said here, because unless we get to grips with managing the public health crisis and the public fallout from COVID, unless that happens, forget about any designs to do with economic recovery. Because quite simply, if people are perishing and you don't have a productive workforce, if you don't have people that are employable, if you don't have markets because people are perishing, then I'm afraid even the best economic plans will be futile. And he listened very carefully, and we went into a discussion then about lockdowns. And anyway, cut a long story short, we were assigned various tasks. So I was asked to head up the private sector health response. There was a colleague that was asked to head up the labor issues. So there were labor issues, and someone was asked to head up the economic recovery. So we were all tasked with things, but the thing that struck us most is it required a very close public-private partnership in South Africa to allow us and to enable us to turn the tide against what was another very sinister public health crisis. Now, public health crises are not new to South Africa or the African continent. I note there are many African colleagues on this call, and welcome to all of them. We're all acutely aware of what we faced as a continent in the early 2000s. when we were getting to grips with the HIV pandemic. And I can tell you in my own country, in the early 2000s, these were devastating times because 300 to 350,000 mainly young South Africans were perishing from HIV/AIDS, very destructive, and if left unarrested, would have had a significant public health impact and also a significant economic impact. So we got about this public-private partnership, and one of the things that came out of this was that we would meet regularly with the president and his team. We would meet sometimes as frequently as once a week. Of course, this was all done on Zoom and virtual calls. We went into a lockdown on the 28th of March, which was shortly after this meeting I'm speaking about. But we also decided to set up something called a solidarity fund. And this meant that private sector companies would make a contribution into the solidarity fund. Some companies took a decision that their executives would donate 50% or even 100% of their salaries into this fund for 3 months. So there were various permutations, but suffice to say that this was a rather unique approach developed here in South Africa, the Solidarity Fund. It landed up raising, in South African terms, a significant amount of funding. And what that did is it enabled flexibility around those who had an urgent need. So those who were devastated, if there was procurement of PPE, for example, that needed to happen on an emergency basis, for particularly frontline healthcare workers, we were able to use these funds. Of course, governance was critical in doing all of this, and we set up all these various working streams to enable us to respond. And as I said, my working stream was around the healthcare response, which involved acquisition of PPE, coordinating the private sector hospitals to admit patients from the public sector, testing, screening, field forces to go out and assist with screening of patients. There was a work stream that involved pharmacists, and the pharmacists were front and center of dealing with the pandemic. And eventually, we also managed the vaccine rollout, again, the private sector vaccine rollout. And at the peak, we have a big anti-vax community in South Africa, but at the peak of the rollout, ours was amongst the fastest in the world per capita. And it's because pharmacists and the pharmacies were front and center very often in this vaccine rollout. At the same time, I had to double task here because I was doing this initiative for and on behalf of the country. And the initiative was called Business for South Africa. But my daytime job at Aspen didn't go away. I still had to continue delivering on my tasks at Aspen. And one of those tasks was that we very early on in the process started surveying the landscape for a vaccine, because there were already, by February or March of 2020, there were already reports that a vaccine in a short space of time, or vaccines in a very short space of time, provided it was done on an emergency review and emergency utilization basis, was quite feasible in under 300 days. And in fact, as it worked out, the first vaccine, the first COVID vaccine, was administered 319 days post the first reported case of COVID, which was, of course, in China. And so it was a remarkable scientific feat. But what it did for us is it enabled us at Aspen to start looking at how we could solve a problem. We have vast capacities and capabilities of sterile injectable capacities, which we were using or about to use to manufacture general anesthetics and other products like injectable thrombolytics. And we decided to pivot and repurpose some of that capacity into the potential to produce vaccines. And at that time, the vaccine that was deemed to be the most appropriate and suitable, i.e., it was the most thermostable, it was a single dose at the time, was the Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine. And we set about a contract manufacturing arrangement with Johnson & Johnson. So this took place in the latter parts of 2020, but suffice to say that by late 2020, so December 2020, for example, Africa had still very little prospect of receiving vaccines. And it was starting to affect, the pandemic was starting to affect lives and livelihoods on although the mortality rates overall were quite low in Africa. Africa was probably the continent hardest hit because of the disruption of supply chains globally. And many parts of Africa have still not recovered economically from what went down with COVID 3 or 4 years ago. It was a very difficult and tense time because the world said, we would act in solidarity, and Dr. Tedros at WHO and various leaders of multilateral institutions came out and said, look, no one will be left behind. And unfortunately, people were left behind because when a crisis hits, governments look after their own people first. We had a shutdown of borders. Prime Minister Modi in India shut borders to the exports of vaccines. There was an anticipation there'd be vaccine supply into Africa from India. There were parts of Europe that also imposed export bans on pharmaceuticals and vaccines. So all in all, it became a very tense, socially tense period, and one that we said as a world will never be repeated again. But the lesson that was learned, because I remember speaking with the European, well, what happened with us, just one more anecdote here in South Africa, is we were the first country in the world to genomically sequence the beta variant. And so this was on the 16th of December, 2020. We realized we were dealing with a new variant. The rest of the world was still alpha variant top heavy. And now we had this new variant that we picked up in South Africa that led to further travel bans and further lockdowns. And it was a very difficult, a terrible Christmas, I remember, was December 2020. But some of the vaccines that we had secured as a country, which were AstraZeneca vaccines, our expert committee said are more efficacious for the alpha variant, and there were concerns about using it against the beta variant. So what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is late December 2020, early January 2021, we had no vaccines. We were going to go into a winter period, and we saw these peaks during winter. Our prevalence doubled with the beta variant over that December, January. And I also remember that the world imposed all these travel bans, these sport bans, and it was really a crazy time. I mean, for all the Indian colleagues on this call, I happened to be chairman of Cricket South Africa at the time, and we had a tour planned by Australia. And I remember having a very tense discussion with the Australian cricket president. He phoned me, it was on the 4th of February 2021, and he said, look, we simply cannot send our team. And I said, but our numbers have come down. They've come down from 21,000 cases a day down to under 100, and said, we simply cannot, we simply cannot chance it. Do you guys have vaccines? And of course, we didn't have vaccines, and that was the problem. So now, why have I gone through this whole historical account? And the one other anecdote, sorry, this will be the last anecdote. I remember speaking to the office of Commissioner Stella Kyriakides. She was the EU Health Commissioner, and I was trying to see if we could trade AstraZeneca for Pfizer vaccines, and it wasn't possible because everyone was looking after their own citizens first. So these are some of the anecdotes, very painful anecdotes. And I mean, all day long while you're doing this, your mobile phone is full of messages from people seeking vaccines and saying, I've just lost my mother or my father or my grandmother or whoever it might be. And I'm certain if they'd been vaccinated, they would still be with us. So they were very, very painful times, deeply painful. But what it did bring to bear is, and I'm going to start going into my slides now. I had to give you these initial anecdotes as a lead up. And I've noticed we're up to now 130 participants, which is more or less where we said we would be. It taught us a very painful but important lesson, that you cannot rely on other jurisdictions, other geographies for vaccines or other critical medicines at a time of a public health crisis. And public health crises are going to manifest from time to time. I think with climate change and antimicrobial resistance and all the other things that we're facing as a global community, I expect these pandemics to occur more frequently, whether it's regional pandemics or endemics or global pandemics, whatever it might be, expect the frequency to increase. So the lesson here is you have to have your own capacities and capabilities to produce your own vaccines, your own pharmaceuticals, particularly critical pharmaceuticals. You've got to be in a position to respond to outbreak pandemics. To respond to outbreak pandemics, you've got to be producing routine vaccines in the first place, so that if you get an outbreak, you can pivot to producing whatever the outbreak requirement is. So, very painful lesson. You'll see from my slides, COVID exposed us, and it shone a strong spotlight on significant global, regional, and domestic health, vaccine, and pharmaceutical inequalities. Those inequalities still exist. And as I said, you will never achieve global health security. And it's our job and task and our responsibility as pharmacists around the world to play a productive role in achieving health security in our lifetime. So when you have this occurring, unnecessary lives and livelihoods are lost. This is particularly the case in Africa. Significant economic impact, as I said earlier. But I also mentioned that at the time, our president, the president of South Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa, was the chairman of the African Union. He shortly thereafter became the African Union COVID champion and is now recently appointed as the African Union Pandemic Preparedness Champion. So he, together with the other African heads of state, resolved to start swiftly establishing domestic and regional manufacturing capacities and capabilities in order to ensure security of supply, both of vaccines, but also to have an element of therapeutic sovereignty on the African continent. So you're not relying or stressing or placing strain on other regions who are trying to satisfy their own patient or citizens' demands. Now, 3 years on, regrettably, I'm afraid to say that we haven't made much progress. Now, what is the measure of progress? The measure is twofold. Firstly, what do the trade statistics look like for pharmaceuticals on the African continent? And Africa continues to be a serial importer of pharmaceuticals, the trade deficit overall, despite manufacturing happening in Northern Africa and some of the Maghreb countries like Egypt and Tunisia, and obviously a significant manufacturing presence here in South Africa. Despite that, the trade deficit continued to grow. And very often the procurers of these medicines are NGOs, multilateral institutions, international procurement agencies like Gavi, PEPFAR, and others. So that's the one measure. There's a growing trade deficit. And to dig a little deeper into that, Africa produces less than 1% of its vaccine requirements. Wholly unacceptable, and that's why we had the crisis we did during COVID. The other measure of how far we've progressed or how far we haven't come, I'm afraid to say, is evidenced by the recent Mpox outbreak in Africa. So I think it's well rehearsed, well recorded in the public domain that Africa's had an outbreak of Mpox in Central, Eastern, and Western Africa. A more pernicious clade 1B, as it's called, manifested there, and it was a more destructive virus, a more sinister virus than the clade 2 that was being experienced in other parts of the world. Of course, Mpox is not a new it's not a new epidemiology. It's been around for some time, but it's this evolution or transition into clade 1, which is more virulent, that became of concern. And again, the wealthier nations had vaccines. They'd already garnered those vaccines some time ago, and Africa was left scurrying around again, trying to find vaccines. So that demonstrated to me yet again the need for urgent and swift establishment of sustainable, and I underline the word sustainable because it's no use putting up capacities around the world, but there's no demand because the procurers are buying from elsewhere and importing into Africa, or because these facilities don't receive orders and you've got to shut them down. And then when the next outbreak happens, you don't have the capacity to deal with it. So urgent action is required. Next slide, please. Okay, so the key to achieving sustainable capacities and capabilities on the African continent, and I could say the same thing here, although I'm dealing largely with Africa, I'm also referencing the need for regional manufacturing in Latin America, in parts of Asia. So the same applies in those geographies as well. I remember I was on a trip, a visit to meet as part of a delegation, to meet the Saudi Crown Prince, and his health minister was with him and said, we were, as Saudi Arabia, as a kingdom, we're one of the largest donors to Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines. And, during COVID, we couldn't get vaccines. So we were the biggest donor. So we're not going to rely on anyone in future. We're putting our own capacities up. So the same regional manufacturing requirement, you can speak to certain parts of Asia and certainly vast parts of Latin America as well. So sustainable capacities and capabilities are dependent on sustainable demand and offtakes and procurement from African manufacturers for African citizens, and equally a supportive regulatory pathway to ensure speed and swiftness. Now, what we also know and have learned from CEPI, which is also a global coalition for epidemics, very ably led by Dr. Richard Hatchett, have been working on this regulatory pathway to get a new vaccine in an outbreak situation to market within 100 days. And that's a very commendable initiative. Many of you on this call will know about it. But it does rely on a supportive regulatory pathway to ensure both speed and swiftness. But in saying this, We absolutely can never compromise on quality, safety, and efficacy of vaccines. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the African regional vaccine capacity establishment, regional vaccine manufacturing, RVM as it's called, what is needed and the role of the pharmacist, because I'm speaking to a FIP audience, and I started off the seminar by saying that I think pharmacists are some of the most understated profession of any profession, let alone in healthcare, because pharmacists just offer so much and very often don't get the credit for what they actually do. And if there's any takeaway from today, it's one, how to respond through regional manufacturing to an outbreak pandemic. And the second thing is that the pharmacist needs to seize greater control of the role that it actually plays, because very often others are deemed to have played that role in the background. And for me, that's an unacceptable position, because you've got a uniquely trained, skilled, competent professional across a number of sub-disciplines, whether it's in clinical, in regulatory, in manufacturing, in hospital pharmacy. You can rattle all these things off. I think the pharmacist needs to play a more stated role than the understated one that they presently are seized with. So those are my two takeaways. But now let me go into what is required, because I said there's urgency required to set up these capacities and capabilities. I've said that sustainable manufacturing is key. You don't want to set up these capacities only to have to shut them down because the agencies that procure or the governments that procure are not buying from these facilities, these regional facilities. They continue to import from elsewhere, and then they run into a crisis again. So this is a 4-point plan. It's obviously a lot more elaborate than this, but I'm just giving you a quick sense, and one that could easily be replicated in any other region. So the first is reform of vaccine and pharmaceutical procurement by international agencies, by undertaking offtake agreements with African or regional vaccine producers or regional pharmaceutical producers. This should ensure sustainable offtakes and build globally competitive economies of scale. So what do I mean by this? I indicated earlier that when it comes to vaccines, Gavi, which is a Global Alliance for Vaccines Initiative, Gavi, and UNICEF, which is its procurement arm, procure around 60% of Africa's routine vaccine requirements, but yet very few, if any, of those vaccines are being acquired or procured from African manufacturers at this point in time. As I said to you, it's 1% or less. So they need to reform their procurement modalities and mechanism to enable offtake agreements so that you have this sustainable demand over a period of time. Now, until and unless you get sustainable offtakes, and speed to market is important, if you don't achieve that, you're not going to get economies of scale. You don't get economies of scale. Manufacturing is all about that. Don't get economies of scale, don't get volume throughput through facilities, don't get recoveries in factories, then you've got to shut these factories down because they're not competitive. So offtake agreements are critical to ensure sustainability of capacities and capabilities. The second point we need is the swift establishment of an African pooled procurement mechanism. This was set up by President Ramaphosa during COVID in 2020-21. And this means that the continent is able, in order to achieve scale, to aggregate its volumes and conduct pooled procurement. This does require significant political will. It's something that is presently being or is presently being seized with by the African Union, and we hope that this does become re-established and institutionalized under the African Union, Africa CDC. The third point of the 4-point plan is the acceleration of technology transfer arrangements ahead of the time. If you are going to get international agencies committing, procurement agencies committing to buying during outbreak, then you need to have a sense of what these antigens look like. You've got to have a sense of swiftness of technology transfer. The vulnerable regions around the world, whether it's parts of Asia or Latin America, or in particular Africa, which I keep reminding everyone on this call, Africa has the most disproportionate disease burden, both infectious diseases and a rising tide of non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease and others. I keep reminding you because if you don't have swift technology transfers at the time of need, you're going to be a laggard and your people won't get vaccines again, and you'll be at the back end of the queue, and the whole cycle will keep repeating itself. So we have to acknowledge that different continents and or different regions have different strengths. Africa does not have great what we would call dozier development capabilities. So a technology transfer model that becomes applicable to Africa would have to be very different to a technology transfer arrangement that you conduct in the subcontinent, in India, for example. So the message here is that parts of the world require technology transfers, but that technology transfer arrangement, or what it looks like, has to be fit for purpose for the capabilities, the resources, the experience, the skill set that exists in those continents, those regions that are most vulnerable. And that's a very important learning. It's no use saying, well, we're going to give you a technology transfer, but that region, that part of the world doesn't have the ability to develop the files or doesn't have the skill set to carry through the tech transfer. The fourth and final point, and I'm not sure if there are any colleagues from the World Health Organization on the call, but for vaccines to be procured in Africa through the Gavi UNICEF mechanism, which is 60% of Africa's vaccine procurement is through the Gavi UNICEF complex. In order for that to happen, your products have to be WHO pre-qualified. My next slide will show you this is a rather tedious process. It could be a 4 to 5 year process. By that time, others are in the market. You've lost your initiative. You're not going to get the economies of scale. You're not going to be competitive. You're not going to be able to respond swiftly to an outbreak pandemic. So this calls for prioritization and parallel submission of regulatory data for purposes of registering and or pre-qualifying these products, particularly vaccines. If I look at the single most procured product in Africa is antiretrovirals, as you would expect. Africa sits with 69% of the world's HIV infected population, but Africa is largely dependent on institutions such as PEPFAR, the Global Fund, UNITAID, and others for the procurement of these medicines. Now, these institutions and or agencies have their own quality, safety, and efficacy requirements. So in the case of PEPFAR, you need US FDA approval. In the case of Gavi, as I said, UNICEF, you require WHO pre-qualification. Same could be said for Global Fund. So if you are going to have an onerous, tedious process that takes you 4 to 5 years, you're not going to succeed. And that's my final point, if I can go on to the next slide. So because I am certain we have on this call a number of regulatory pharmacy colleagues, a number of colleagues that are no doubt seized with clinical trials and do clinical trial development and establishment of study protocols, etc. The current process, regulatory process, is not supportive of either regional manufacture nor the establishment of sustainable manufacturing. The current process looks something as follows: to conduct a technology transfer, provided it's a fit-for-purpose transfer, can take you up to 12 months. Thereafter, you're required to register the product with your domestic NRA, your domestic regulatory agency. In the case of myself here in South Africa, SAPRA is our NRA. They would have to register us. That could take 18 to 24 months. Then only once you've completed that step can you apply for WHO pre-qualification. That can take you another 18 months. And in the case of 9 of the 54 African countries, there's an additional step, which is 9 of those 54 countries. Fortunately, they're not the bigger markets, but they also require you to register your product once you are pre-qualified in that country. So this is a 4 to 5 year process, hardly a way to respond to any outbreak situation, and hardly an efficient process. And that is why the last point, which I think pharmacists have got a great role to play in, and that was my 4th point in my preceding slide of the 4-point plan, is priority reviews and parallel registrations or approval process. So this is really, really an important thing that pharmacists, particularly the pharmacists on the African continent, in those vulnerable regions that I spoke about earlier, we need to become seized with this particular point and drive it to a solution, and that solution is priority reviews and parallel registrations. Now, I can tell you that this is something that Dr. Tedros, the Director General of WHO, has a great affinity towards. It's interesting when you speak in these international fora. I saw a message pop up earlier, a colleague greeting me from a conference that we were together as, it was an IPSF, International Pharmaceutical Student Federation Congress in Vienna in 1990. So I'm giving my age away here. But interestingly, that one of the colleagues that I met at one of these conferences, his name is Rogerio, is now the head of WHO pre-qualification. So it's interesting how you encounter colleagues throughout the years, and at the most unlikely time you meet these colleagues. So Rogerio is the head of WHO PQ. He is very favorably disposed towards this priority review parallel submission to try and truncate the timelines, try and help patients, try and help healthcare systems. Next slide, please. Okay, so we, as a local pharmaceutical, a domestic pharmaceutical industry in South Africa, spent a fair amount of advocacy time, some time lobbying our own separate regulator. And I'm pleased to say that after much engagement and interaction, our domestic manufacturer has now introduced a priority review policy for locally produced products. So that will also help shorten, if you recall in my previous slide, I said it could take you up to 18 to 24 months to register the product domestically. So those timelines will be cut down significantly through a priority review now for locally produced products, particularly those products that are required for public health crises and or emergencies. So that was a significant development and step forward, and a number of countries on the continent and beyond have these priority reviews for locally produced and or localized products. And as I said, the idea here is to truncate the timelines. There were 3 steps. The one was the technology transfer timeline, which I said could take 12 months. The idea is to shorten that for having more for purpose tech transfer arrangements. The second was your own NRA, reducing the timeline at 18 to 24 months. In the case of SAPRA, we're hoping to shorten that to 6 months. And then the WHO PQ, if you do a parallel submission, so while you're submitting to SAPRA or your domestic NRA, you're also at the same time submitting to WHO PQ, you can significantly cut down the timelines for both the domestic piece and also the PQ piece that happens out of Geneva. Next slide. Okay, so just to start ending off, what the call for here is, and as I indicated, I expect that there are a number of pharmacists on this call that are either in policy making in the public sector or are seized with the regulatory pathways, regulatory pharmacists, in other words. And I think your continued advocacy to make these pathways and timelines more efficient, more collaborative, reliance programs around the world, and the mutual recognition and harmonization, all of these things are really important to ensure that we get, and this is the final message I want to leave you with, you have to have a very close alignment, a seamless alignment between industrial policy, public health policy, regulatory policy, and procurement policy. So all four of those have to act in concert, seamlessly so. And if you achieve that, then you can respond to outbreak pandemics, you can respond to patients, you can save lives and livelihoods, and I think that you can start developing sustainable capacities and capabilities, which will all lend themselves to health security. I think every single one of us on this call exists professionally only for one reason alone, and that is to ensure health security for patients. And that's how you achieve it, with the alignment of those four policies. So in conclusion, colleagues, if you can just go to my last slide, I think it's a thank you slide. I think I've covered everything. The main take-home messages here I want to leave you with, it's sake of being repetitive, but it's probably not a bad thing. Number one, never understate or underestimate your value as a pharmacist in dealing with all of these pandemics. You should be and ought to be front and center. Second point is we need to collaborate through partnerships globally to ensure that we have sustainable capacities and capabilities across all regions, all continents around the world. If we don't have sustainable capacities, facilities will shut down, and then when you need them in a crisis or an outbreak, you don't have them, and unnecessary lives and livelihoods are lost. The third and final point I wanted to speak about, again in the spirit of partnerships, for those of you on the call and the FIP head office or head HQ in Den Haag, we need to keep this clarion call for procurement policies to change so that we are able to sustain regions and we are not leaving our citizens, our patients in the lurch in any form or shape. So colleagues, that's my presentation. Those are the three take-home messages. I think we have about 11 minutes for questions. I'm not sure, Nicolina, welcome to you. Perhaps you can turn your camera on for a second. I think you're going to be managing this part of the program, I think.
Yes.
So I'll hand back to you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for holding this insightful session. So during the presentation, we did collect some questions from the attendees, and I'm inviting everyone to still use the Q&A box to leave any questions which you may have for the speaker, and of course, I will be able to read them out. So one of the questions that we received was from a regulatory standpoint, what would be for you the role of the young AMA, African Medicine Agency?
Okay, so I've seen all three questions and I'm going to respond to them. Let's start with the AMA question. So Africa for some time, through various initiatives, Zazabona is one of them, has been looking at a model where you integrate and harmonize pharmaceutical regulatory pathways and requirements across the continent. This is all housed in the AMRHA, as it's called, which is the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative. And the agency, akin to the EMA that you've got in Europe, for example, is the AMA. The AMA has been recently set up in Kigali, Rwanda. And I think what we need here is we need speed and swiftness in capacitating the AMA so that it can start implementing a harmonized approach across the continent. In parallel to that, because I accept these things do take time, in parallel to that, there are 6 African countries that now have ML3 status for their regulators, and I'm talking for vaccines. There's an option that while you're building up to AMA, that you develop a set of standards with these 6 or any other additional ML3s that you get on board, and they then become a standard that's set across the entire continent. Now, why do you want to do that? You want to do that because I've just explained the difficulties, the challenges, and the timeframes involved with the World Health Organization, PQ. So Africa's resolved that it needs its own regulator. It shouldn't be outsourcing it elsewhere. And the AMA is critical to that. Now, Robert Moss, around the WHO Pandemic Prevention, Preparedness, and Response Accord, it's been disappointing that the accord has not been signed, and it's run into some difficulties. I've got a rather, and I'm speaking at a World Trade Organization, WHO combined session next Friday, the 13th. And I don't know if there's a virtual participation. There must be. And this will be alongside Dr. Tedros, Dr. Ngozi, who's the Director General of WTO. And I think we start getting seized with the issues of intellectual property. Now, I've got a very practical view around intellectual property. I think that there are well recorded, well rehearsed voluntary licensing arrangements that worked during HIV/AIDS during that era. We were able to save hundreds of thousands, millions of lives on the African continent using those. I think we shouldn't try and keep reinventing the wheel. I think there are arrangements that have worked that we could try and ease off some of the tensions with just by looking back at what we've got and using those again. But certainly disappointing that it hasn't been signed yet. One of the South Africans is Precious Matsotsi, is very involved in this, and I was speaking to her the other day, and hopefully we'll be able to get some conclusion around this. The question around regional hubs, an absolute necessity, because if you take a diverse continent like Africa, which is 54 countries, you cannot set up 54 different manufacturing facilities. You just won't have the volume throughput to economies of scale. So you've got to be smart around who produces what, with an underpinning or an anchoring that these regional hubs should have sufficient volume and economies of scale to be sustainable and competitive. But for regional hubs to work, and where they have worked, you've got to have pooled procurement. And that's why I heavily emphasized as point 2 of the 4-point plan, the need for pooled procurement, which requires significant political will. I accept that on the African continent to take place, and hopefully it'll be a realization soon. I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that. Right, then, Joyce, you've asked me for an example of a change in procurement policy. So I think the most practical example to use, because we've spent a lot of time discussing vaccines in this webinar today, Gavi UNICEF is a classic example. So Gavi UNICEF presently do not procure vaccines from Africa. And the way to initiate this procurement is for these institutions to have set-aside arrangements. Now, Gavi's kind of started this. They launched in Paris. I was at that meeting under the patronage of President Macron, because France is a big donor to Gavi. Launched the AVMA, which is the African Vaccine Manufacturers Accelerator, which enables a subsidy of 30 US cents per dose procured from an African manufacturer up to a maximum of $1. That's for fill and finish. There's a different arrangement for drug substance production, and one, if you've fully integrated, then there's a different incentive, right? Now, that's a start, but that doesn't guarantee you orders or volumes. So the reform that needs to happen is you've got to have initial offtake agreements as part of procurement policy. And if you get those offtakes, you will start getting volume. And then you don't even need to subsidize anyone or incentivize anyone later, because they will have the economies of scale to be able to compete on their own 2 feet. Okay, Joyce, you had a follow-up question. What are some of the incentives that countries can come up with to encourage local regional pharmaceutical manufacturing? There are many. Just in the interest of time, let me cover 4. The one is at an industrial development level, there's a wide range of suites of incentives internationally. I think India's done particularly well with special economic zones, RDZs. These usually carry tax allowances where your tax rates are down rated, sometimes down to 0% for a period of time. You get accelerated depreciation schemes. You get soft trade loans, subsidized land, water, electricity, etc. Those are usually in some form or permutation what you would find in a special economic zone. So that's one way of doing it. The second way is a capex build incentive, which is a tax allowance, as I was saying earlier. The third is the lever of public procurement to preferentially procure from local manufacturers. Call it local procurement preference if you wish. That can be done through set-asides or designations. And then the last area is rewarding local manufacturers by making the regulatory processes, the ease of doing business, reducing red tape and bureaucracy. And a good example of that was what I indicated earlier, where a domestic or national regulatory agency, NRA, can say, look, we will give you a priority review if you're going to produce the product locally. You're a local investor, you're investing in the economy, you're employing local people, you're upskilling them, you're retaining talent and skill in the country. So those are just 4. There are many others, but those are kind of 4. I think, Nicolina, that concludes all the questions that I can see. Don't know if there are any others, because
Yes.
I know we only have 2 minutes left, right?
Yes, thank you very much for proactively following up on the questions. Indeed, those were all the questions that were collected. So if in case anyone has any follow-up questions, even after the webinar, feel free to follow up on the email webinars@fib.org, and then we will, of course, forward them to the speaker. So thank you very much once again. And yeah, I will hand it over to Matthew for closing words.
Sorry, Nicolina, just before Matthew closes, I just wanted again to re-express my gratitude to FRP, particularly to my good friend Didier, who was instrumental in setting this up, and all the people at HQ. Much appreciated. And I'm extremely, I suppose, privileged to have had this opportunity, because it does allow me that opportunity yet again to say that we as pharmacists have a fundamental role to play in the healthcare system, in the value chain of healthcare, and in the broader economy of any country. So let's never be understated in what we seek to do. Let's rise to all the challenges and use our full skill set and competence to keep delivering health security for people around the world. So thanks very much to FRP for this opportunity. Matthew, back over to you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Stavros, for a very, very interesting presentation on a topic of great current interest and importance. You have been very clear about what the issues are and what we need to do to move forward in case another pandemic happens, or even without pandemic, so to say. So thank you very much, Dr. Stavros. This has been one of the most interesting presentations that we have had lately. And thanks everyone for attending the webinar. Thank you.